This is the body cam footage of the moment Officer Garrett Finch detained United States Federal Judge Franklin Hayes, accusing him of stealing his own high-end bicycle. The ensuing encounter, fueled by racial bias and an abuse of authority, would not only cost the city $18 million, but would also land the officer in federal prison. The incident began on a sun-drenched Saturday afternoon in a quiet, tree-lined suburb, a place where property values were high and suspicion of black men was apparently higher. Judge Franklin Hayes, dressed in sweat-wicking athletic shorts and a sleeveless shirt, clicked his cycling shoes out of the pedals of his carbon fiber racing bike. The machine, a sleek black servolo that cost more than some used cars, gleamed under the afternoon sun. He leaned it carefully against the ornate brick gatepost of his own home, stretching his calves as the satisfying ache of a 30-mile ride settled into his muscles. He was 54 years old, but his dedication to fitness kept him looking a decade younger. It was his sanctuary, this physical exertion, a way to clear his mind from the immense weight of his duties on the federal bench. The quiet of the afternoon was abruptly broken by the crunch of tires on gravel and the low growl of an engine. A police cruiser, stark white and blue, had slowed to a crawl beside him. The window rolled down, and a face framed by a crew cut and reflective sunglasses peered out. "Everything all right here?" the officer asked. The tone was deceptively casual, but Franklin had spent a lifetime deciphering the nuances of language, both in the courtroom and on the street. This was not a question of concern. It was a question of suspicion. "Everything is perfect, officer," Franklin replied, his voice calm and even. He gave a polite, neighborly nod. The officer, whose name tag would later be identified as G. Finch, wasn't satisfied. He cut the engine, and the sudden silence was heavy. The car door opened with a metallic groan. Officer Finch was a man who seemed to be made of sharp angles and coiled tension. His jaw was tight, his movements deliberately slow and dominant as he stepped onto the pavement. His eyes weren't on Franklin, they were on the bicycle. He circled it like a predator sizing up its prey, his gaze lingering on the brand name, the disc brakes, the electronic gear shifters. "That's a nice bike," Finch said, the words hanging in the air. It wasn't a compliment. It was an accusation in waiting. "Thank you," Franklin said simply, refusing to take the bait. He continued his stretch, wanting nothing more than to go inside, shower, and spend the rest of the day with his family. Finch's gaze finally snapped to Franklin, traveling from his worn running shoes up to his sweat-dampened shirt and finally to his face. "A real nice bike," he repeated, slower this time. The implication was as clear as the blue sky above them. "A man like you shouldn't have a bike like this." The seed of conflict, planted in prejudice, had just begun to sprout. Franklin straightened up, his easy post-ride demeanor evaporating, replaced by a careful, guarded stillness. He knew the script. He had seen it play out in case files and heard it in testimony countless times. He just never imagined he would be its protagonist, standing on his own property. "Is there a problem, officer?" Franklin asked, his tone still level, but now carrying a new firmness. He met the officer's stare without aggression, his posture open and non-threatening. But inside, a cold, familiar weariness began to settle in. He was no longer Franklin Hayes, husband, father, and cycling enthusiast. In the eyes of Officer Finch, he was just a black man with something he shouldn't have. The body cam footage, later released, would show the timestamp in the corner of the screen, a digital clock ticking toward a confrontation that would ruin one man's career and reaffirm a painful truth for another. The shaky lens focused on Franklin's face, then panned down to the expensive bike, then back up, mimicking the officer's own suspicious evaluation. The audio picked up the distant chirp of birds and the rustle of leaves, a peaceful soundtrack to an ugly, brewing storm. The first act of a drama that would reverberate from this quiet street all the way to the federal courthouse was underway. Officer Finch ignored the question. Instead, he unclipped the radio from his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is 3, Adam 14. I'm out on foot on Crestwood Drive, investigating a possible 10 to 55-inch a stolen vehicle." By classifying the bicycle as such, he was already framing the narrative, building a foundation for a report that would justify his suspicions. Franklin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He recognized the tactic immediately. It was a preemptive measure to create an official record of a potential crime. giving his stop the veneer of legitimacy. "Officer, this bicycle is not stolen," Franklin stated, his voice a low, steady baritone. "It belongs to me." Finch let out a short, humorless laugh. It was a sound of pure derision. "Right? It belongs to you," he said, drawing out the words with mocking disbelief. He gestured vaguely at the large, colonial-style brick house behind the gate. "You live around here?" The question was a test, layered with assumptions about who belonged in a neighborhood like Crestwood. "I do," Franklin said, his gaze unwavering. He did not elaborate. He would not offer up personal details to placate a man who had already judged him. Every piece of information he provided would be twisted and used to build a false case. He knew the procedural dance all too well. Finch took a step closer, invading Franklin's personal space. The top of Franklin's head barely came to the officer's chin, but Franklin stood his ground, a pillar of composure against a tide of aggression. "I've been getting a lot of reports," Finch lied, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial tone. "A lot of break-ins in this area. High-end stuff going missing. Bikes, electronics. You know how it is." Franklin knew exactly how it was. It was the generic, all-purpose justification for a racially motivated stop. The "we've had reports" line was Chapter 1 in the Handbook of Biased Policing. "I'm sure the residents appreciate your diligence, officer," Franklin said, the words carefully chosen. It was a subtle challenge, a reminder that he, too, was a resident. The irony was lost on Finch. "So, you wouldn't mind showing me some proof of ownership, then?" Finch pressed, his hand now resting on the grip of his firearm, a casual but unmistakable gesture of intimidation. "A receipt, maybe?" The request was absurd. Who carries a receipt for a bicycle they've owned for 2 years while out on a ride? It wasn't a genuine inquiry. It was a tool to create a scenario of noncompliance. "I don't carry receipts for my personal belongings with me when I exercise," Franklin explained, his patience wearing thin, but his voice remaining a mask of control. "The bike is registered, however. The serial number is on the bottom bracket." He pointed toward the underside of the frame. "You are welcome to run it." This was a concession, a way to de-escalate while still asserting the facts. He was providing a path to resolution, a way for the officer to verify the truth without further harassment. But Officer Finch wasn't interested in the truth. He was interested in being right. "I'll do that," Finch sneered. "But first, I'm going to need to see some ID." This was the critical juncture. The demand was unlawful, under state law, and affirmed by countless court decisions, some of which Franklin himself had cited in his own opinions. A person not suspected of a specific crime and not operating a motor vehicle was not required to identify themselves. It was a foundational principle of Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable searches and seizures. Franklin took a slow, deliberate breath. He had to make a choice: comply with an illegal order to make the problem go away, or stand on his rights and risk escalation. For a man who had sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution, there was only one real choice. "Officer, with all due respect, I am not legally required to provide you with identification," Franklin said, his words precise and clear. "You have not articulated a reasonable suspicion that I have committed, am committing, or am about to commit a crime. You have only expressed an opinion about my bicycle." The legalistic phrasing, the calm assertion of his rights, acted like gasoline on the fire of Finch's ego. The officer's face, already tight, hardened into a mask of fury. The reflective sunglasses couldn't hide the angry glare. To Finch, this wasn't a citizen exercising his constitutional rights. It was a criminal talking back, using fancy words to try and get away with something. "Oh, a lawyer, are we?" Finch mocked, his voice dripping with contempt. He jabbed a finger toward Franklin's chest. "Listen to me. You are being detained for investigation of theft. Now I'm giving you a lawful order. Show me your ID, or you're going to be taking a ride downtown for obstruction." The threat was explicit. The bodycam lens shook slightly as Finch took another aggressive step forward. On the sidewalk across the street, a woman walking her dog had stopped, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. A car slowed as it passed, its occupants turning their heads to watch the unfolding scene. The audience was growing. Franklin felt a profound sense of exhaustion wash over him. He was a federal judge. He had presided over complex cases involving international cartels, corporate espionage, and matters of national security. Yet here he was, on his own street, being threatened with arrest by a patrol officer whose entire basis for suspicion was the color of his skin. The sheer, grinding absurdity of it was almost too much to bear. But his composure was a shield he had spent a lifetime perfecting. He would not give this officer the satisfaction of seeing him break. "Officer Finch," he said, reading the name tag for the first time. "A lawful order must be predicated on a lawful basis. Your detention of me is not lawful. Therefore, your order is not lawful. If you place your hands on me, it will be considered battery." The statement was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, a final warning from one part of the legal system to another. But Finch heard it as the ultimate act of defiance. He had been challenged, his authority questioned by a man he had already deemed a criminal. His training, his temperament, and his prejudice all converged into a single, decisive action. "That's it," Finch snarled, his patience completely gone. "You're under arrest." He lunged forward, grabbing Franklin's arm in a powerful grip. The sudden, rough contact sent a jolt through Franklin. The bodycam footage lurched violently, capturing a blur of motion as Franklin was spun around and shoved against the cool metal of the patrol car's hood. The woman across the street gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Her other hand was already reaching for her phone. The satisfying click of the bike's shoe on the pedal was a distant memory, replaced by the sharp, metallic rasp of handcuffs being unlatched from a duty belt. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on him as Finch twisted his arms behind his back with painful force. "You have the right to remain silent," Finch began, reciting the Miranda warning in a clipped, angry monotone as he cinched the cold steel tight around Franklin's wrists. The words were a bitter irony. Franklin had administered oaths, instructed juries, and written opinions on the very rights now being read to him as he stood cuffed and powerless on his own street. The officer's hands were rough and impersonal as they began to pat him down. Franklin remained silent, his face pressed against the dusty hood of the cruiser. He focused on his breathing, on maintaining control in a situation designed to strip him of it. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him, the silent judgment and confusion. He could see the reflection of his own face in the car's polished paint, a distorted image of a man in athletic clothes, now a suspect. Finch's search was aggressive. He roughly checked his pockets, pulling out a small, folded wallet and a separate, slim leather holder from the zippered pocket of his shorts. He tossed them onto the hood of the car with a clatter. "Let's see who our lawyer really is," Finch muttered, picking up the wallet first. He flipped it open, his thumb swiping past a few credit cards and a small amount of cash. He was looking for a driver's license, a name to run through the system, a record to confirm his bias. He found a state-issued ID card. "Franklin Hayes," he read aloud, then glanced at the address. Crestwood Drive, the same street they were on. For a brief second, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Finch's face. The address matched, but he quickly dismissed it. It could be a fake ID, or maybe he was a guest, a house sitter, a worker. The narrative of guilt was too strong to be derailed by a single inconvenient fact. "Doesn't prove this bike is yours," Finch declared, tossing the wallet back onto the hood. His confidence was returning. He then picked up the second item, the slim leather holder. It was black, with no markings on the outside. It felt rigid, official. Finch pried it open with a sense of theatricality, as if he were about to reveal the final, damning piece of evidence. The bodycam zoomed in, the lens focusing tightly on the object in his hands. Inside, behind a clear plastic window, was a laminated card. It was not a driver's license. It was not a credit card. It was dark blue, with a striking gold eagle embossed at the top. The words were stark, printed in a severe, official font. "United States Federal Judge," the top line read. Below it, "Judicial Branch of the U.S. Government," and under that, the name, "The Honorable Franklin C. Hayes." Below his name was his title again, "United States District Judge, District of Columbia Circuit." And next to the text was a photograph of the man currently in handcuffs, looking directly into the camera, dressed not in sweaty athletic wear, but in the solemn black robes of his office. Time seemed to stop. The chirping of the birds, the distant traffic, the rustle of the leaves, it all faded into a deafening silence in Officer Finch's ears. The only sound was the frantic thumping of his own heart. He stared at the ID, then his eyes darted to the face of the man pressed against his car, then back to the ID. The face in the photo was the same. The name was the same. The Honorable Franklin C. Hayes. He had just arrested, handcuffed, and publicly humiliated a federal judge. The color drained from Finch's face. The arrogant smirk, the hardened jaw, the look of contempt, it all dissolved in an instant, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure, unadulterated panic. His hand holding the ID began to tremble. The body cam, still focused on the ID, captured the slight tremor. It was the visual record of a man's entire world collapsing in on him. "Officer," Franklin's voice was low and dangerously calm from his position against the car. "I believe you have made a significant and career-altering error." The words, spoken with the quiet authority of a man who wielded immense power, landed like hammer blows. Finch flinched as if he'd been physically struck. He fumbled with the ID, nearly dropping it. His mind was a whirlwind of denial and terror. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a fake. An incredibly good fake. But his gut, the same one that had been so sure of Franklin's guilt just moments before, now screamed at him that it was real. Every detail, from the embossed seal to the specific font, looked terrifyingly authentic. This is, Finch stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. He couldn't finish the sentence. "This is fake," he finally managed to say, but the words lacked any conviction. It was a desperate, pathetic attempt to cling to the reality he had constructed. "No, Officer Finch, it is not," Franklin replied, his voice devoid of any emotion except a profound, chilling certainty. "That is my judicial credential, and you have just unlawfully detained and battered a sitting federal judge. I suggest you think very carefully about your next actions." The panic in Finch's eyes intensified. He looked around wildly, as if searching for an escape. He saw the woman across the street, her phone held up, clearly recording. He saw another neighbor peering out from their window. The quiet suburban street had become a stage, and he was the villain in a play that was rapidly spiraling out of his control. His hand, the one not holding the judge's ID, went for the key to the handcuffs on his belt. His movements were clumsy, frantic. The confident, intimidating enforcer was gone, replaced by a fumbling, terrified man trying to undo a catastrophic mistake. "Sir, Judge," he sputtered, the words tumbling out in a panicked jumble. "There's been a misunderstanding. I had reports of theft." He was already trying to rewrite the narrative, to build a defense for the indefensible. "There was no misunderstanding, officer," Franklin cut in, his voice like ice. "There was prejudice. Now, you will do two things. First, you will remove these handcuffs. Immediately. Second, you will get on your radio and request that your direct supervisor and the shift commander report to this location. Am I understood?" The tone was no longer that of a victim. It was a command. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed, a voice that resonated with the full weight of the federal judiciary. Finch, his face pale and slick with sweat, nodded dumbly. He fumbled with the key, his shaking hands making it difficult to find the keyhole. The metallic click of the handcuffs springing open was unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He released one of Franklin's wrists, then the other. Franklin slowly brought his arms around to his front, rubbing the raw, red marks the steel had left behind. He did not move from his position leaning against the car. He simply stood there, watching Finch with an unwavering, analytical gaze. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. Finch was no longer the one in control. He was now the subject of a federal judge's scrutiny, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his life had just been irrevocably altered. He reached for his radio, his hand still trembling. "Dispatch," he said, his voice cracking. 3, Adam 14. "I need a supervisor at my location. Crestwood Drive." Now the dispatcher's tinny voice came back, asking for the nature of the request. Finch hesitated, his eyes darting back to Judge Hayes. "Just get him here," he choked out, unable to articulate the disaster he had created. He knew that when his sergeant arrived, it wouldn't be to back him up. It would be to begin the long, painful process of damage control. The footage would later show him leaning against the side of his patrol car, his head in his hands, as they waited. The arrogant enforcer had been reduced to a man awaiting judgment. And judgment was coming. The arrival of Sergeant Peterson was a study in controlled alarm. He pulled up behind Finch's cruiser, his expression already grim. He was a veteran of the force, a man who could smell a career-ending incident from a block away, and the frantic, garbled call from Finch had set off every alarm bell he had. He saw Finch, looking pale and defeated, and then he saw the other man, calm, composed, and radiating an aura of authority that was utterly at odds with the situation Finch had described. Sergeant Peterson approached cautiously. "What's going on here, Finch?" he asked, his eyes scanning the scene. Finch couldn't meet his gaze. He just gestured weakly toward Franklin. He has ID, Sarge." Peterson turned to Franklin, who had pushed himself off the car and now stood tall, the red marks on his wrists a stark testament to what had just occurred. "Sir, I'm Sergeant Peterson. Is there a problem?" Franklin met the sergeant's eyes. "Sergeant, your officer, Officer Finch, detained me without reasonable suspicion, accused me of stealing my own property, and when I asserted my constitutional rights, he arrested me, placed me in handcuffs, and conducted an illegal search." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "He did all of this in front of my home." He gestured to the brick house. Peterson's face went from grim to ashen. He looked at the house, then back at the man in front of him. He understood immediately. "My name," Franklin continued, his voice cold and precise, "is Franklin Hayes." He held up the leather holder, which he had retrieved from the car hood. "I am a United States District Judge, and what your officer has done constitutes a flagrant violation of my civil rights under the color of law." The phrase, "under the color of law," was a legal term of art, and Peterson knew exactly what it meant. It was the specific language used for charging police officers with federal crimes. This was no longer a simple complaint. This was a federal matter. Peterson's professionalism took over, a desperate attempt to contain the fallout. "Judge Hayes, on behalf of the department, I am profoundly sorry," he began. "Let me assure you," Franklin held up a hand, cutting him off. "Sergeant, your apologies are noted, but they are insufficient. I want a full report of this incident on my desk by Monday morning. I want every piece of body camera and dash camera footage preserved as evidence. Officer Finch is not to have any contact with me or my family. I will be speaking with the chief of police and the city attorney personally." Each sentence was a directive, delivered with the finality of a court order. Sergeant Peterson could only nod, his mind racing through the protocols for an officer-involved incident that had just escalated to the highest possible level. He instructed Finch to remain in his vehicle and to not touch his report until he was told to do so. He then formally took Judge Hayes's statement, his pen flying across his notepad, documenting every detail of the encounter from the judge's perspective. The bystanders, who had remained as silent witnesses, began to disperse, their videos already being uploaded, shared, and captioned. The story was out of the bottle, and it was about to go viral. By Monday morning, the incident was the lead story on the local news. The grainy cell phone video of a calm black man being handcuffed next to a high-end bicycle was juxtaposed with a professional photograph of the Honorable Franklin C. Hayes in his judicial robes. The headline was explosive. "Officer cuffs federal judge for stealing his own bike." The police department was thrown into a full-blown crisis. The chief of police held a press conference, announcing that Officer Finch had been placed on administrative leave pending a full internal and external investigation. He offered a public apology to Judge Hayes, calling the incident deeply troubling and not representative of the values of our department. But Judge Hayes knew that apologies without action were meaningless. He had seen the system protect its own too many times. He had presided over cases where official misconduct was swept under the rug with a suspension and a quiet settlement. He was in a unique position to ensure that this time, the consequences would be real. He did not want revenge. He wanted accountability. He wanted to use his power to expose and challenge the systemic rot that allowed an officer like Garrett Finch to operate with impunity. After consulting with his family and a trusted team of civil rights attorneys, he made his decision. 2 weeks later, a lawsuit was filed in federal court. Hayes versus City of Northwood, et al. The et al. Included Officer Garrett Finch personally. The suit alleged violations of the 4th and 14th Amendments, citing unlawful seizure, excessive force, and racial discrimination. It demanded not only compensatory and punitive damages, but also court-mandated reforms for the Northwood Police Department, including enhanced de-escalation and implicit bias training. The lawsuit sought $18 million, a figure carefully calculated to be high enough to force the city to take the matter seriously. But for Judge Hayes, the money was secondary. A press release from his attorney stated that any and all damages awarded would be donated to the Legal Defense Fund and a local initiative dedicated to mentoring at-risk youth. The legal battle was swift and decisive. The evidence was overwhelming. The body cam footage was damning, capturing Finch's escalating aggression and clear bias. The cell phone videos provided a third-person perspective, corroborating the judge's account. And most critically, Officer Finch, under pressure from federal investigators who had been alerted to the case, made a fatal error. In his initial sworn report, filed before he knew the identity of the man he had arrested, he had fabricated details, claiming that Judge Hayes had been acting suspiciously and had attempted to flee. The video evidence proved this was a blatant lie. This lie elevated the case from a civil rights violation to a federal crime. The Department of Justice opened its own investigation. Officer Garrett Finch was indicted by a federal grand jury on 2 counts: deprivation of rights under color of law and perjury. The city, facing an unwinnable lawsuit and a public relations nightmare, quickly moved to settle. They agreed to the full $18 million, along with a consent decree that mandated the reforms Judge Hayes had demanded. Officer Finch was fired from the police department. His union, seeing the mountain of evidence against him, declined to fight the termination. His criminal trial was short. His defense attorney argued that it was a mistake, a misunderstanding born from the pressures of the job. But the prosecutor presented the jury with the video, with Finch's sneering tone, with his dismissal of every attempt at de-escalation, and with the cold, hard proof of his lies. The jury, a diverse group of citizens from the same community, deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Garrett Finch, the man who had wielded his authority with such arrogant certainty, stood pale and trembling as the judge sentenced him to 36 months in federal prison. It was a sentence that sent shockwaves through law enforcement circles across the country. An officer was going to prison not for a shooting, but for a wrongful arrest born of prejudice. Judge Franklin Hayes was in the courtroom for the sentencing. He watched not with triumph, but with a deep, somber sense of gravity. He had not wanted this for Finch, but he knew it was necessary. It was the only way to send a message that the badge was not a shield for bigotry. It was the only way to enforce the principle that the law applies to everyone, especially those sworn to uphold it. Months later, as he pedaled his Cervelo along that same quiet street, the afternoon sun warm on his back, Franklin Hayes felt a sense of peace. The check for $18 million had been signed over to the charities. The new training programs at the Northwood PD were underway. A man was in prison. Justice, in this one rare instance, had been served. But he knew the fight was far from over. His experience was a stark reminder that no amount of status, education, or authority could fully protect a black man in America from the poison of prejudice. As he turned into his driveway, he saw a neighbor wave, the same woman who had filmed the encounter. She smiled, a gesture of solidarity and respect. It was a small thing, but it was a start. The incident had changed the street, changed the town, and for a brief, vindicating moment, it had bent the arc of the moral universe just a little bit closer toward justice.